Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Settle down, please. Settle down. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben, and I'll be your speaker this morning. Interesting thing happened in the first service. The rows towards the back of the church were all cordoned off. I guess they're encouraging people to sit further forward. However, I noticed that the very back corner over there was not cordoned off. That is because the church staff have learned. Last year in the summer, when they wanted everyone to start moving forward because there were fewer people attending, they just took all the chairs in the back corner and put them away. All of us who were from the back corner walked in and saw no chairs where we sit. What the church staff had failed to realize is that everybody sits in the same seat every week. So if you take away our chairs, we're not going to move forward. We're just going to stand in a big huddle at the back, looking lost, until somebody figures out, hey, the chairs are behind this door. And so during the service, chairs are coming out, and we're all, we always have a ride in the back. So I noticed they didn't do it at all for this service, but I appreciate that we are learning animals, and we learned. Also, I hope everyone likes my new shirt that I got for today. I used to buy a lot of green because it goes with my eyes, but nowadays I'm buying stuff that goes more with my hair. You gotta stay current. We're going to be following along with the general theme that we've had going for the last few weeks, which is diving into the Old Testament. Spencer has been working through the book of Genesis, which, as I think we've all seen, had some questionable characters. Now, good people, godly people, certainly people God could make use of, but certainly some of the things that they did were a little questionable in our eyes. I'd like to take a break from that and leap forward to the book of Daniel. Daniel was a smashing fellow. He was a very, very upstanding individual, and he lived in a world that was very different from his beliefs and practices. There are a lot of things in the book of Daniel. If you're not familiar with this little book, I suggest you check it out. It's only about 9 chapters long, and there's so much stuff in it. And normally when we talk about Daniel, we talk about his visions and prophecies and interpretations of dreams. I'm going to ignore all that today, and I'm just going to talk about how Daniel lived his life. So here's the setting for the book of Daniel. It's about 600 BC. It's in the period of the kings, the late period of kings, and Israel and Judah have separated into 2 separate kingdoms, and they're at this time being hammered by the empires that are rising from the north. First it was Assyria, and Assyria has just recently been overthrown by Babylon, and the new Babylonian Empire is spreading through the known world. This is one of the times that Jerusalem was besieged and taken, and Daniel was one of the captives that was carted off to Babylon. And we'll pick it up in Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who have been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So Daniel is in effect a slave, but he somehow found himself a pretty good gig here, where basically he's going to be educated, housed, fed, and given a fairly prestigious job. But looking at the setting of Daniel himself, think of it this way. So Daniel was forced to live and work in a foreign land. His employer and most of his peers did not share his beliefs. He was given very specific rules which he was to follow, and the consequences of failure were severe, which we'll learn more about in a little bit. Compare the setting of Daniel to our setting today. As Christians, we live and work in a foreign land, in that we don't live necessarily in a Christian culture. Our employers and most of our peers often do not share our beliefs. We have to follow the laws of the land, even if they aren't always based on a set of values that are similar to ours. The consequences of failure, i.e., not obeying Canadian law or not doing what you have to do at the workplace, can mean for us ostracism, depression, and poverty. Jesus himself described the difference between the world and heaven, and said that in effect we are living in a foreign land. I have a passage from Matthew chapter 22, but this passage also appears in Mark and Luke. So the setting, this is in the final week of Jesus' life. He's already had the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He's been teaching at the temple and in Jerusalem and is gaining a lot of followers. Then the Pharisees met together to plot how to trap Jesus into saying something for which he could be arrested. They sent some of their disciples, along with the supporters of Herod, to meet with him. "Teacher," they said, "we know how honest you are. You teach the way of God truthfully. You are impartial and don't play favorites. Now tell us what you think about this. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus knew their evil motives. "You hypocrites," he said. "Why are you trying to trap me? Here, show me the coin used for the tax." When they handed him a Roman coin, he asked, "Whose picture and title are stamped on it?" "Caesar's," they replied. "Well then," he said, "give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." His reply amazed them, and they went away. Interesting here, just as a side note, Jesus and the apostles after him taught that it was okay to leave the Old Testament laws behind. We were no longer bound by them. But they never said, go ahead and start breaking all the Roman laws. They lived in the Roman Empire, and the Christian movement was not intended to be armed rebellion. There were no Christian terrorists blowing up the temples of the Roman gods. There were no Christian political parties trying to change Rome. It was not that kind of revolution, and we know that. And that's what made the Jews so angry, is that it wasn't that kind of revolution. So Jesus and the apostles were clear. No, we still live in society. You still have to follow society's rules. That's just part of it. You're just not bound by those. So it's actually a mentality that has existed all the way through, from the Old Testament with Daniel, through Christ's own teachings into today. But back to Daniel. This is his first challenge. As we've already read, he was brought into education and finery, but his first challenge was that he was told he had to eat the food and wine that the king would give him every day. So what did he do about this? In chapter 1, verse 8 and to 16, Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided to the others. So what did Daniel's example say, and what can we take from that? In this case, Daniel was faced with something which would have broken his laws. we can compare that to something that would be in conflict with our faith. But he didn't cause a fight. He didn't wail and gnash his teeth and tear his shirt. He just suggested a reasonable compromise. He said, what's the real reason for this? Well, the king wants us to be healthy. Okay, well, then how about we do this instead? They tried it out, it worked, and they moved on. So he was able to find some sort of solution that allowed the real purpose to be maintained, but it did so in a way that didn't affect his faith. So note, he was cooperative, he wasn't confrontational, and he wasn't a Pharisee. I said he wasn't showy in his faith, saying, oh, look at me, I'm just eating vegetables and water. No, he did it very quietly and just showed that it worked. What kind of examples today would this be for us? I mean, obviously we're not bound by the food laws anymore, so this isn't appropriate. But some examples might be, let's say you're working in your company, you've all just finished a big project, the team is happy, you want to relax late on a Friday afternoon, and the boss says, hey, let's all just go for a drink together. Let's just hang out as friends and colleagues. Well, perhaps you don't drink. Well, if the purpose of this outing is just comradeship and friendliness, there's nothing wrong with you going along and just having a soda water. You know, you can still engage in that companionship and that friendship without doing something that goes beyond your beliefs. Another example from the workplace would be foul language. Some of us work in places where there's a lot of foul language and it's just the norm. Could be that you as a Christian just don't engage in that. You don't have to go wagging your finger at everyone saying, oh, watch your language. I guarantee you it won't be effective. But you can still set the example quietly, non-confrontationally, just don't engage in that. And here's a third one. I want to see a show of hands for this one. Who here has ever engaged in gossip in the workplace? Yeah. It's one of the things that gets us through the workday quite often, is gossip. But it's also very clear that gossip is something that we are not supposed to do. It is a harmful activity, and it's something that we should avoid. So gossip that's a really good example, I think, of it's a minor infraction. You know, it's a minor breaking of our faith in that, you know, I don't think anyone's necessarily going to die because of this, but it still can cause damage, real damage. And it's something that is so easy to do, and you're never going to get called out for it, but you shouldn't do it. And there's an easy example. If you find yourself in a place where your coworkers are gossiping, you can either just not engage, or you can perhaps try and pat it down a bit. Well, we don't actually know what's going on, guys. Something like that. So using Daniel's example, if you come across something which is a challenge to your faith, a minor challenge to your faith, then there are ways to deal with it which are cooperative, non-confrontational, and not showy, but still very valid and strong. Daniel, a little bit later on, once he'd finished his education and had joined the king's court, had a second challenge. And this was, he was the only person who could interpret the king's dream. Now this is interesting. I love this, actually, what King Nebuchadnezzar did. He told all his wise men, I've had this dream, I need it to be interpreted. And they all said, oh great, O king, tell us what the dream was and we'll tell you what it means. And the king said, no, you tell me what my dream was, and then you tell me what it means. Which of course puts all the sorcerers and wise men and fortune tellers, scrambling, because of course none of them know what he really dreamed. And the king was so angry by this reaction that none of them could tell him what his dream was, that he was going to kill all of them. All the wise men in Babylon were going to be put to death. So, what did Daniel do? Picking it up in chapter 2, verse 24. Then Daniel went in to see Arioch, whom the king had ordered to execute the wise men of Babylon. Daniel said to him, don't kill the wise men. Take me to the king, and I will tell him the meaning of his dream. Note there what Daniel did right out of the gate. He didn't say, don't kill me, I can do this. He said, don't kill everyone. So right away, he was looking beyond himself. Arioch quickly took Daniel to the king and said, I have found one of the captives from Judah who will tell the king the meaning of his dream. The king said to Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, "Is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" Daniel replied, "There are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. Now I will tell you your dream and the visions you saw as you lay on your bed." Note also what Daniel did here. He didn't take credit for this. He didn't say, "Yes, O king, I can tell you your dream." He said, "God can tell you your dream, and God has told me to tell you." So he interprets the dream for the king, which I'm going to skip over because that's for another sermon. But in verse 47, after he's revealed the meaning of the dream, the king said to Daniel, "Truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret." Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. At Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are his 3 Hebrew friends who were brought along with him. These are their Babylonian names. In VeggieTales, they're called Rak, Shack, and Benny. To be in charge of all the affairs of the province of Babylon while Daniel remained in the king's court. So in this case, what does Daniel's example show us? It's this: if you're given the opportunity, boldly display your faith. I realize that it can be uncomfortable for us as Christians living in a non-Christian world or working in a non-Christian workplace to be open about our faith. Sometimes people can be openly hostile. More often, they're indifferent and uncomfortable and just don't want any of that religious stuff coming at them. Fair enough. But sometimes there are opportunities. Sometimes a person will ask a question or they'll make a comment, and you will know in your heart that they're open to hearing about this. And that's your opportunity. It may not be the CEO wakes up and says, "I've had this dream. Which one of you middle managers can tell me?" But it might be something a little more subtle than that. But it doesn't mean that the opportunity isn't just as important. And so if you have that opportunity, don't be afraid. Be bold. But at the same time, be gracious. Be generous. And give credit to God, not yourself. Just as Daniel said, "Don't kill all those Babylonian wise men," which, according to the New Testament or the Old Testament, he might have been able to do that okay, because there were a lot of times in the Old Testament where God said, "Yes, kill all of the non-Hebrews." But in this case, no. And Daniel, first thing he said, "Don't kill them all." Then Daniel gave credit to God before himself. So if you have the opportunity in your life, in your workplace, don't use it as an opportunity to slag off the non-Christians. Be gracious, be generous, and give credit to God. Now, years later, Daniel was still in the service of the court. In fact, he'd even outlived the king, and there was a new king, King Darius. And here's where Daniel was faced with another challenge, which was far more serious than the previous ones that I've mentioned. And that is that he would not worship the king. He would only worship God. As I'll describe in the passage, there was a law that was passed saying that everyone had to worship only the king. Now, this is an example of one of those showstoppers. This is where you can't find a compromise. This is where you can't make this into an opportunity to talk about your God. No, this is cut and dry. You will be put to death if you worship anybody other than the king. And Daniel wasn't going to do it. So this was a much more serious challenge. Today, you might liken it to some things like this. Maybe shady practices at work. If you work for the government or for a large organization, no one's going to notice if you take a sheaf of printer paper and put it into your bag and take it home, right? You might be in a position where you have to mislead your customers, where perhaps you're not quite telling them the whole truth about what it is that you're selling them. Interesting, I spoke to Pastor Byron about this morning. and he used to be a used car salesman. And he was actually told by one of his colleagues, Byron, man, you're never going to make it in this business. Why? Well, you're too honest. You're just too honest, you know. And so he became a priest. So Byron took that opportunity to serve God in a different way. Also, examples are, particularly when you are doing business in other countries, although not always, what about bribes? What about you're not going to get that deal, that big, lucrative, fat deal, unless you grease somebody's palm a little bit? These are sorts of business practices which occur, and you may be faced with them. What are you going to do? And outside of business, what about immoral behavior? Let's say that that Friday afternoon, you've all finished the project, the boss says, let's all go out for a drink. So you go out with your colleagues for a drink, you enjoy your soda water, good companionable time, but they've had a few more drinks, and now they've all decided, hey, let's take this party down to Monty's, which I've heard is a strip club. Not that any of us here would know that, but they all say they want to go to a strip club. Now, of course, that's crossing the line. Okay, having a soda water with your friends in a pub because of it's a social thing, that's fine. Going down to a strip club, though, no, there's a very different reason why you're going there. That's not just a companionable thing. That's where you draw the line. Here's another show of hands that I want to ask. This one's fun. Okay, so in your job, how many of you have ever been to a Vietnamese whorehouse? But let me explain. All right. So in my previous job, I used to travel overseas quite a lot, and I had to deal with foreign companies, and I have local agents in the different countries. I was in Vietnam, and my agent had taken me around to visit a bunch of shipyards. It's fine, normal day, but I kept asking him because we weren't in Hanoi anymore. We were up in Haiphong, and I didn't know we were staying that night. We didn't have a hotel booked. I'm like, well, where are we staying tonight? Don't worry. Okay, so we finished our day of meetings, and then we picked up some of the managers from the shipyards that we'd been at that day, and they joined us. We're all going to go for dinner together. Okay, that's fine, sure. I mean, it's one of those things you do with business development. So we have a nice dinner somewhere in Vietnam. I don't know where we are at this point. And I'm still wondering, it's getting late now. I'm getting tired. I just want to go to bed. Where are we going to a hotel? So no, don't worry. So we get in the truck. We're all drunk. Okay, good. Finally, we're going to bed. And then all of a sudden, the truck turns off the road and down the side road, and they're all giggling away. And I'm a little surprised at where we're going. And sure enough, yes, there we are, from this place. I mentioned foul language earlier. I may or may not have used some at that point to express my extreme displeasure with where we were. Now, as it turns out, none of them really cared, because I was just an excuse for them all to get together and go have their fun. But the point is, if ever there was an opportunity for me to get away with this, there it was, right? I'm in the middle of Vietnam. Nobody knows where I am. Nobody knows who I am. I can assure you there was absolutely no temptation. I was repelled by the entire incident. And really what I should have said at the beginning was, who here has stood outside a Vietnamese whorehouse? That's really what happened. I stood outside and was adamant. I want nothing to do with this. But I had to stand my ground. One of the younger Vietnamese colleagues I was with, who'd been married for 6 months at this point, he came to me afterwards. He was like, wow, you really love your wife, don't you? Yes. Yes, I do. And yes, I do. Love you, baby. But more than that, I love my God. I mean, I'm not going to do this. Come on. So hopefully he learned a lesson that day because of my example. So, but what happened to Daniel? What was Daniel's example? So, he would not worship the king. He would only worship God. Picking it up in chapter 6, verse 4. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. And by the way, if you do lead a very upstanding life and upstanding work life, you may very well, progress and do well, and people may be jealous of that. So, this may be one of those attacks that comes at you from behind just because you are such a swell person. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, "Long live King Darius! We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except for you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked." So King Darius signed the law. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. As you can imagine, he was eventually discovered. He was arrested and brought before the king. The king was very sad because he liked Daniel, but he had signed this law, and he couldn't change it. And so he couldn't think of a way to get Daniel out of it, and ultimately had to throw him to the lions. So we pick up the story in verse 16. "So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, 'May your God, who you serve so faithfully, rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, 'Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you served so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions?' Daniel answered, 'Long live the king! My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty.' The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God." So what does Daniel's example tell us? Know when to refuse the demands of this world and remain faithful to God. Know where that line is that you cannot cross. Recognize the difference between a compromise you can make, for example, with the foods that Daniel refused to eat but found another solution. Recognize the difference between that and a demand which genuinely is just incompatible with our faith. Cannot do that. Can't even go there. You don't have to be outraged about it. There doesn't need to be any tearing of shirts and gnashing of teeth. You can be quiet but firm in your belief. Look at what Daniel did. He received this law from the king. He didn't protest. He didn't wail. He just went on praying to God like he always does. He didn't try to fight the law. He just said, "Nope, I'm going to do what I do," knowing the risk of what might happen if he was caught. And that's the second point, is trust that God will take care of you. Know that we can try our best to stand up to the forces in this world. We won't always be strong enough, but God is. And remember that God is always with us. And if we are faithful to him, he will be faithful to us. Interestingly, at the end of this particular story, the king was so impressed with Daniel's faith, with Daniel's God, that he actually took all the people who had accused Daniel, threw them in the lion's den with their families. So this was a high-stakes world that Daniel lived in. But Daniel risked it to remain true to his faith. So taking these 3 examples, how do we effectively live in this world? 1, if possible, find another solution, which will still give a good result, but will allow you to stay true to your faith. 2, if you're given the opportunity, display that faith boldly. 3, know when to refuse the demands and to remain faithful to God. And then fourth, don't be afraid of what might happen. And this is a big one. We do live in a world where we are not faced with death every day. We don't live in a war zone. We don't live in extreme poverty. We live a very comfortable life. You know, for most of us, if we break a nail, it's a big deal, and we fear that. So what we're talking about here, there are some real consequences sometimes to maintaining our faith. Bad things might happen to us, and we might know what those bad things are before they happen to us. We know the consequences of not following the demands of our world. You might say to yourself, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my friends. I don't want to go to Africa. These are legitimate concerns, but you have to remember a couple of things. One, God will provide. God is stronger than anything in this world. He will provide for us. If we are loyal to Him, He will be loyal to us. Remember also that God's will is more important than our will. So it's true, maybe you don't want to lose your job, but maybe God does want you to lose your job because He's got something even better waiting for you later on. You don't know that yet. You can't possibly know that yet. And maybe God doesn't want you to know that yet because He wants you to move forward in faith. And also remember that Jesus never promised us an easy life as Christians. Jesus and the apostles never said, believe in Jesus and you will be popular and wealthy and lose 20 pounds. They never said that. In fact, often they said quite the opposite. So we have to realize that being Christians can be tough, and we live in a world which is not driven by Christian values. But we still have to be part of that world. Just as Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. We are expected as Christians to obey the laws of the land, to be good citizens, except when it becomes something that goes directly against our faith, in which case we aren't called to be revolutionaries. We aren't called, to storm the legislature. No, we are called to be quiet and firm, to set the example, to remain true to God. When given the opportunity, boldly display our faith and stay on this side of the line. So even though Daniel lived more than 2,500 years ago, I think that he stands out as an amazing example of how to live in a foreign land. And I think that even though the circumstances of his life are very, very removed from ours, I think that we can look to him as an example of how should we act when we're faced with the little challenges, with the big challenges, and with the opportunities to share our faith. Look at Daniel and see what he did. And I think we can all draw strength from that. He's a timeless example for us now and moving forward into the future. Let us pray. Lord God, thank you for bringing all of us into this particular corner of the world where we don't have to suffer with war and poverty and starvation on a daily basis. We have a comfortable life. But please help us to not be complacent, to not give in to the temptations and the rules of this world that go against your teachings. Help us to be strong, to know what our faith means, to know when to find a compromise, when to stand our ground, and when to share our faith boldly. Help us to remain humble and generous and gracious, and above all, loyal to you. Amen.
Thank you so much.